The Aidusgun was crowdfunded in late 2020 on Kickstarter and shipped in 2021. Contrary to its name, it's not a gun but a flashlight-looking add-on which can be attached to Picatinny-like rails. It is a gyro controller which pays attention to vibration in order to interpret it as a shot event. It thus can be attached to any gun with compatible mount as long as the gun has strong force feedback or other means to transmit the trigger press to the controlled device independently. In the campaign, the Aidusgun was suggested to be used with electronic or gas-operated airsoft guns. After the Kickstarter campaign succeeded, the Aidusgun is now available on Indiegogo. The Aidusgun is heavily advertised as a VR gun, but it will work just fine as a regular gyro controller too. It can be set up to behave like an absolute or relative position mouse device. Its sensitivity is adjustable in the so-called distance window of the companion application. This app has to run, and the Aidusgun won't be usable without it if a game isn't specifically making use of the Aidus software development kit. A second companion app assists in connecting the provided USB Wi-Fi cord with the Aidusgun. This software makes a startup entry into the Windows task scheduler, which personally I find a bit invasive and thus restrained it. The Aidusgun just has two buttons. At the back is a latching power button. On the left hand side is a rather tactile push button switch. In relative position mode, this button acts as a cutoff for the motion data to correct for the typical drift that all gyro controllers suffer from. In absolute position mode, a double press will reposition the mouse cursor into the center of the monitor for drift compensation. The lack of user programmable buttons must be understood if a purchase is considered. The user has to rely on another control device such as a keyboard or foot pedal for additional functions when using an airsoft gun, or would use a gun controller that transmits its inputs independently to the computer. On the bottom is a USB-C socket which allows charging the built-in battery. It is reported that charging for 1 hour should hold up for 7 hours of use. Although the original campaign claimed that the controller can be used optionally in a wired fashion, that didn't work for me. The Aidusgun connects to the computer over Wi-Fi. This connection can be easily made to many existing Wi-Fi cards, but Aidus ships an additional IP time branded one in the package. This is very welcomed as it allows the player to use the controller while staying connected to the internet and not having to choose one over the other. The Aidusgun owes its excellent 5 ms poll rate to this high bandwidth connection type. Even apart from the theoretical performance capabilities, I appreciate the optionally dongle-less design. The build quality of the Aidusgun is very high. It feels rigid and sturdy. The details are sharp and clear, while the surface is very smooth. Portions of the rail mount are metal made and the screws are O-ring stabilized. That the offset compensation button is relying on a push button switch is a strange choice, as its tactile actuation is often enough to trigger the gyro sensor as shot event. Before I continue to discuss the Aidusgun, I would like to reiterate common problems associated to gyro gun controllers. First off, even a theoretically perfect gyro gun can just perform somewhat accurately if the player remains stationary positioned perpendicular to the display. As soon as the player changes the distance, or even worse the angle to the display, the zeroing of the sights is completely off. If the player doesn't stand in a 90-degree angle to the display, tracking will never be accurate to begin with. This is for a theoretically perfect gyro gun, mind you. In practice, however, a second problem comes into play: drift. If you move the gun from the center to the sides and then back to the center, an on-screen crosshair won't perfectly align again to where it was. The degree of how well gyro guns are able to keep the zero position often is one of their most important properties. While vast differences exist, all gyro controllers suffer of this issue without exception. Generally, the more vigorous the movement is, the higher the resulting offset. Arguably, this challenges the force feedback use case of the Aidusgun, but in practice I found it to be tolerable. Most gyro guns are inferior to most light guns, and gyro guns should not be considered as a substitute. In a situation, however, in which light guns can't be used, gyro guns still have their place to shine. In most cases, this orthogonal compatibility comes down to relative versus absolute positioning, but there are of course exceptions. Personally, I love to have gyro guns around for games like Big Buck Hunter Arcade, which sadly doesn't support absolute position devices. Also, I admire the bravery to release such a controller in 2021, when the market seems saturated and many people lost trust in gyro guns. The Aidusgun tracks very well for a gyro gun. Notably, however, is the higher degree of drift along the x-axis compared to the y-axis, which I found annoying. Subjectively, I would say it's happening more if I hold my arm in a semi-supported position, like leaning on the armrest of a chair. In some sessions, however, I seemingly succeed keeping such additional drift to a minimum. Still, I would rate the Aidusgun's tracking capability slightly lower than the one of my custom Steam gun of episode 109 and the one of the Desert Wolf by Loving Global. The fact that the Aidusgun reacts to a force feedback event as a substitute to a trigger press when using airsoft guns causes a notable delay. Depending on the nature of the force feedback, it will also make aiming much more difficult and increase the spray pattern. This issue can be circumvented by attaching the Aidusgun to an existing gun controller instead. One could use AR guns like the ones I have shown in episode 194 or build something custom. The player would simply map one of the buttons to the left mouse and presto, no force feedback is needed. While there are keyboard to mouse conversion programs, I chose to quickly write my own to make sure it's high performing and doesn't do any shenanigans in the background. In my opinion, a match made in heaven is pairing the Aidusgun with the PP Gun Mini. The latter is my favorite AR gun and my favorite VR gun, and I have covered it before in episodes 194 and 215. Originally, this gun was supposed to receive a gyroscope module from Shenzhen Simeng Technology, but sadly that one was never released. Even if 2 of the inputs are mapped to the mouse buttons, the user still has 14 buttons more available. And even if the player doesn't choose to use the native controller buttons, the PP Gun Mini's force feedback is strong enough to trigger the Aidusgun. The airsoft gun which is most often seen with the Aidusgun in promotional materials is called P18C and was made by Tokyo Marui. It looks like a Glock 18C. It is a so-called electric blowback pistol or short EBB, which runs from 4 AAA batteries. The name blowback comes from the reciprocating slide. The gun can be set to semi or full auto fire via a switch at the bottom rail. The P18C will happily accept alkaline batteries, but I run it from nickel metal hydride and lithium polymer rechargeable cells. It won't work on nickel zinc cells. In contrast, Tokyo Marui's AEP series of guns have built-in rechargeable batteries and stationary slides. Considering the low price, Tokyo Marui guns have an outstanding build quality and I can clearly recommend them. The force feedback on the P18C is arcade-like in strength, but sadly also in sound. Depending on your living situation, EBB guns are too loud for nightly play sessions. In order to still evaluate the airsoft gun use case, I acquired a cheap AliExpress Glock, put in a microcontroller, a reed relay and a small solenoid, which is positioned over a hole in the frame, right over the accessory rail. When I pull the trigger, the plunger of the solenoid beats right onto the Aidusgun. As alluded before, the potential problems with airsoft guns is the lack of buttons and the delay in shot recognition. If the player isn't going for a high score and merely tries to have a good time, airsoft guns are still a fun way to use the Aidusgun. The Aidusgun was shipped in a sturdy black cardboard box. It is printed nicely and looks elegant. In the box were a manual, a USB-C cable and a small metal-cased USB stick, which contained the necessary software, an SDK, a promotional video and 2 versions of a demo game. The demo games were priced at $20 each in both campaigns. I noted that the supposed total value of the package contents is miscalculated on the Indiegogo page. In the Kickstarter campaign, a shooting analyzer program valued at $130 was part of the bundle. That software isn't distributed anymore with the Aidusgun, but the old total bundle price is still referenced. The VR demo game gave me an opportunity to see how the Aidusgun performs in virtual reality. I was surprised about the accuracy and the angular in-game representation of the gun, the comparably low amount of drift, and how well aiming worked considering the Aidusgun is just a gyro controller. The two included games make use of the SDK and communicate directly with the Aidusgun. The VR use of a gyro gun is not comparable with lighthouse tracking, as I showed it in episode 215. There is no depth information at all for gyro controllers. The gun moves at a constant radius around the player. Thus bringing the gun close to the head or stretching the arm makes no difference, and is prone to cause motion sickness. Still, after trying out the VR Entertainment Gun controller in episode 177, I wouldn't have thought that gyro guns can be as well performing as the Aidusgun is in this demonstration. While the lack of a decent library of supported games won't let me recommend the Aidusgun for VR, it changed my opinion on VR gyro guns. The PC version of the demo is much the same. Instead of moving the head, the player shifts the playfield with the A and D keys. In both versions of the demo, pressing the calibration button will horizontally reset the zero position, while leaving the vertical axis unaffected. Personally, I like the Aidusgun. It suits a very specific demographic for very specific use cases. If you are not within this sphere, chances are that you wouldn't enjoy the Aidusgun. For me, it's great to finally have means to use my favorite non-light gun controller on PC. Aidus launched another Kickstarter campaign in 2021 for a gun-mouse joystick hybrid, which is called Nextstick. It is supposed to be released in 2022. Another gyro gun which can be obtained already today would be the Desert Wolf, which I have shown in episodes 194 and 215. This is the end of the review. My name is Ben. I thank you for viewing.